It's the 19th of May, 1845. Two ships leave England. Crowds line the riverbank at Greenhithe to watch them go. Nobody standing there believes these men can fail. That is the whole story in one sentence. And it is the reason none of them came home. The ships are HMS Erebus and HMS Terror. Bomb vessels, built to absorb the recoil of enormous mortars, which means they are built thick. Reinforced hulls, iron plating at the bow, steam engines lifted out of London locomotives and dropped into their bellies, so that when the wind dies, the ships can still push. Heated water piped through the living quarters. 3 years of food in tins. They are, by the standards of 1845, the most advanced vessels ever sent into the ice. The mission is the Northwest Passage, a sea route across the top of North America connecting the Atlantic to the Pacific. Britain has been looking for it for 3 centuries. There is only a small gap left on the map, a few hundred miles of blank paper, and the Admiralty is confident that this expedition will simply fill it in. The commander is Sir John Franklin, 59 years old, a veteran of Trafalgar, a man who had already nearly died in the Arctic once on an overland expedition in the 1820s in which 11 of his men perished and Franklin himself was reduced to eating lichen scraped off rocks. He came home from that and was celebrated. The press gave him a nickname, the man who ate his boots. They meant it kindly. By the end of July 1845, 2 whaling ships spot Erebus and Terror in Baffin Bay, waiting for a break in the ice, ready to enter the channels of the Canadian Arctic. 129 men aboard. After that, no European sees them alive again. Here is what the men on those decks believed. They believed the Arctic was a problem of engineering. Cold could be solved with heat. Distance could be solved with steam. Hunger could be solved with tins. And the people who had lived on that ice for thousands of years, who knew where the seals were and how to build a shelter from snow in an hour, and how to travel with almost nothing, those people had nothing to teach the Royal Navy. That belief killed all of them. It took years for anyone in Britain to admit that something had gone wrong. There was no distress signal. There was no wreckage. There was simply an absence, growing longer. Franklin's wife, Jane Franklin, refused to accept it. She wrote to the Admiralty. She wrote to the American president. She spent her own money outfitting search vessels and offered rewards to anyone who would go and look. Over the following decade, more than 30 expeditions went into the Arctic hunting for the lost ships. They found pieces. On Beechey Island, a small stone island in the passage, searchers found the expedition's first winter camp, tin cans stacked in a pile, and 3 graves cut into frozen gravel. John Torrington, a stoker, dead on the 1st of January, 1846. He was 20 years old. John Hartnell, dead 3 days later. William Braine, dead in April. 3 men gone in the first winter, before the real trouble even started. The headboards gave their names and dates and nothing else. For 140 years, that was all anyone knew about them. Then, in the 1980s, the anthropologist Owen Beatty exhumed those 3 graves. The permafrost had preserved the bodies almost perfectly. Beatty found faces, eyelashes, skin. He also found unusually high levels of lead in the tissue and proposed that the expedition's tinned food, sealed with lead solder, had been poisoning the crew from the inside. It's a compelling theory. It is still debated. Later researchers have argued the lead may have come from the ship's water systems, or that the levels, while high, were not unusual for Victorian Britons, and that tuberculosis and malnutrition are the likelier killers. What isn't debated is simpler and colder. Something on those ships was going very wrong very early. Then, in 1859, on the northwest coast of King William Island, a search party under Francis Leopold McClintock found a cairn, a pile of stones, and inside it, a single sheet of paper. It is the only written record from the expedition that has ever been found. The paper is a standard Admiralty form printed with a request in 6 languages that whoever finds it return it to the nearest consul. And it has been written on twice. The first message is dated the 28th of May, 1847. It reports the ship's position, notes that they wintered at Beechey Island, and ends with 2 words: all well. The second message is scrawled around the edges of the first, sideways, in the margins, 11 months later. It is dated the 25th of April, 1848. It says that Erebus and Terror had been trapped in the ice since the 12th of September, 1846. 19 months, frozen in place, going nowhere. It says that Sir John Franklin died on the 11th of June, 1847, 11 days after someone wrote the words, all well. It says that the total dead now stand at 9 officers and 15 men. And it says that the 105 survivors have abandoned the ships and are setting out on foot for a river on the mainland, hundreds of miles to the south. The paper was signed and left in the stones, and the men walked away, dragging boats on sledges across the ice. None of them made it. Search parties following that route found what they left behind. And what they left behind is the strangest part of this entire story. They found a ship's boat mounted on a heavy sledge with 2 skeletons inside it. And in the boat, packed carefully, was silk, scented soap, slippers, curtain rods, books, silver cutlery, polished, engraved with officers' crests. Dying men hauling several hundred pounds of table silver across an ice field. And the boat was pointing the wrong way. It had been turned around. It was headed back north, back toward the ships they had already abandoned. Now the part Britain could not forgive. In 1854, 5 years before that boat was found, a Scottish surgeon named John Rae was surveying in the Arctic for the Hudson's Bay Company. Rae was unusual. He had learned to travel the way the Inuit traveled, light, fast, living off the land, building snow shelters instead of hauling tents. Near Pelly Bay, he met Inuit hunters who told him about a group of about 40 white men starving, dragging a boat southward some years earlier. They described the objects those men carried. They sold Rae relics, a silver plate, a piece of an order of knighthood, cutlery bearing Franklin's officers' initials. The physical evidence was undeniable. Rae took it home. And he took home one more thing. The Inuit had told him what they saw at the final campsites. Rae reported it plainly to the Admiralty. That from the state of the bodies, it was clear the last of the men had been driven to what he called the last resource: cannibalism. Britain did not respond with grief. Britain responded with rage. Jane Franklin mobilized her allies. Charles Dickens, the most famous writer in the country, took to his magazine Household Words and demolished Rae in print. He argued that the testimony of the Inuit was worthless and that English sailors, disciplined and Christian, would never do such a thing. The witnesses were dismissed, in Dickens's words, as people whose word could not be trusted. John Rae had done what no one else had managed. He had found the answer, and he had found it by listening. He was never knighted. He was never forgiven. Because the story Britain wanted was a story about heroes beaten by an unbeatable enemy, not a story about arrogant men who starved to death in a pantry. And here is the turn. They were all telling the truth. Not Dickens, not the Admiralty, the Inuit. In 1997, the anthropologist Anne Keenlyside examined bones recovered from a Franklin site on King William Island and found cut marks, clean, deliberate, made by metal blades at the joints. The pattern of defleshing. Later analysis found bones that had been broken and heated, consistent with the extraction of marrow. The final stage. The last resource, exactly as Rae had reported it. And then the ships. Inuit oral history had always said where they were, where one had sunk in deep water, where another had come to rest in a bay close enough that people had gone aboard. For 160 years, no one with a research budget took that seriously. Then they did. Inuit historian Louis Kamukak spent decades gathering those accounts and matching them to the map. And in September 2014, a Parks Canada team found the wreck of HMS Erebus sitting on the seabed where the stories said it would be. 2 years later, in 2016, HMS Terror was found in a bay, again exactly where Inuit testimony had placed it. The knowledge had been there the entire time, offered freely, written off as unreliable. In 2021, DNA identified one of the dead from a bone found on King William Island, John Gregory, an engineer aboard Erebus. And in 2024, researchers identified another set of remains as Captain James Fitzjames, the man who commanded Erebus after Franklin's death. His jawbone carries cut marks. Which means that in the end, rank meant nothing. The captain was eaten by his own crew. So what actually killed the Franklin expedition? Not the cold. People live there. People have lived there for 4,000 years, without steam engines, without tinned meat, without iron-plated hulls. What killed them was the certainty that they had nothing to learn. They sailed with 3 years of food and no ability to hunt. They dragged silverware and abandoned survival. They were surrounded by the only people on Earth who could have saved them, and they were, by training and by temperament, incapable of asking. And when a man came home with the answer, in their own language, carrying their own silver, they destroyed him for it, because the answer was not the one they wanted. So think about the thing you're most certain of, the one you'd stake your reputation on, the one you'd stop listening about. It's the 19th of May, 1845, and 2 ships are leaving England, and everybody watching from the riverbank is absolutely sure. That's what it feels like. From the inside. Right up until the ice closes.